What's up, guys? In today's video, I'll be recreating the Avenged Sevenfold Hail to the King drum sound using just Toontrack's Superior Drummer 3. If you're interested in this process, then stick around. I'll be doing a full breakdown of how I got the sound using just Toontrack's Superior Drummer 3. Alternatively, if you just want the preset and want to start jamming or recording with it, I'll leave a link down in the description where you can download the preset. Alright guys, let's jump into it. Really quick guys, before we jump in, I'm going to show you an A-B comparison of what we have versus the actual track. Alright guys, so I did a video where I showed the whole process of me going through and doing all the EQs and the balances, but the audio did not record properly. So what I'm going to do is just going to give you a review of what I did to get close to the sound. The first thing I did was just make sure I have a drum groove that matches the groove of the song that we're trying to sound similar to. Now, the next thing I did is load up this plugin, ADPTR. This allows me to reference between what's in Pro Tools and the actual song quick. For copyright reasons, I will not be playing any of the snippets of the song, but I did reference back and forth quite a bit to get the drums sounding similar to the Avenged Sevenfold record. So the very first things that I did really was go through the kicks, and then I EQ'd the kick in. It sounded like this originally, and after EQ I gave it a little bit of top end here, and then took out some around mid-range just because it was a little pokey and a little aggressive over there. And on the next video, I'll like to show you the process itself, because it's not that I just went in and soloed every channel and then started going to town on it. It was more just a process of soloing, unsoloing, listening to the whole thing, and then deciding what to do next. So with this kick out, initially I just had a transient designer on it and no EQ, but this is how it sounded without anything. With the transient designer, made it a lot tighter, and then I added an EQ to it to get a little bit of low end from it, so that sounds like this before, after, and we turned that down considerably, and you'll see here in a second why. The next thing was the snare. So the snare top, without anything, sounded like this. And for the snare, the actual basic kit that comes in Superior Drummer, we changed the snare on it. I think it comes with the Slingerland Radio King as stock. So I chose the Tama Bell Brass snare for this. And then now we went to the mixer, and the first thing I did to the snare was just EQ it, give it a lot of top end, high frequencies. I call high frequencies either top end or high end. So whenever you hear top end or high end, it just means high frequencies. And similarly, if you hear low end or bottom end, that's just low frequencies. So initially, I added high frequencies to make sure, and once again, this is why I want to show you the process rather than a summary of what I've done, because initially I added just a lot of top end to everything to make sure the clarity is there, and went down the strip and did that to everything. And then I came back and started adding low end to get more weight and girth. Anyway, so now we have the snare where I added a lot more high frequencies to the sound, and also, as you can see here, a little bit of mids and a decent amount of low frequencies as well, just so the snare, when you make it clear, doesn't lose its weight. So here, let me give you a before and after. So here's the before, and here's the after. And let's just volume match it. Before, after. And then let's put it back to... And as you see here, I've cut out a lot of low end on the snare as well, anything below 150, 160, just because I generally don't use any of that, and it just makes the snare sound a lot tighter. Alright, great. The next thing that I really did was not the compressor on the snare, but I went down the strip, as I mentioned before, and EQ'd the hi-hat here. So took out some, let's go to the hi-hat, took out some of that low-end muffle on there, and then added some of that top end, so it's a little bit more clear and crisp. So we started with this, and then we came to this. Let's volume match it. Cool. After that, since we have no toms for this section, or for the majority of the song, to be honest, the next thing I really just went to was the overheads. And same thing, just gave it a little bit of a filter, so we take away some of that low end, and before and after. So a little bit of that kick is gone, and also it just cleans up that low end, so things are just a little tighter. And then we went to the room, and same thing, we did some EQing on the room, so this is how it sounded before, without anything. And then here it is after. So before it was a little muffled, and then after we just made it a little bit more clear and took away all that low end muffle. Alright, cool. So after that, don't worry about, I have some samples here, but don't worry about that. We'll get to that in a second. After that, really what I did was go back to our kick in and bus those two together, so both of them go to one bus over here, which is our kick bus, and also bus the snares, so both of those go to a snare bus. And after busing, or somewhere before or after busing, I put on a compressor on the snare to give it a little bit of pop. So here was the snare, just EQ'd. And then here it is with the compressor. Let's crank that mix, but let's volume match it. Before, after. Cool. So let's put the volume back, and let's just bring that mix down just a little bit here, because I had it, I think I accidentally brought the mix down, but I think it also sounds a little better with the mix at 80%, so without the compressor and just the EQ. with the compressor. Has a lot more pop to it. Okay, so then, as I mentioned, I bussed these two snares together, so they were going through our snare group here, and then I just put a transient designer on the snare here, on the snare group here, to tighten up the snare a little bit more. So I'm just gonna solo these two snares to give you an idea of what I was talking about, to give you an idea of that. So that's the snare top and bottom without the transient designer, with the transient designer. Just makes it a little tighter. Then the next thing that I did, as I mentioned, we bussed the kick, so I think the next thing was just the kicks. So with the kicks bust, the two kick mics bust, I added an EQ here and brought up the high end quite a bit and took away this mid frequencies just because it was super harsh. So I'm gonna give you without. It's very pointy and harsh with. And the low end, the taking out of the low end I did later on, and I'll explain it to you in a second here, but for right now, I added this EQ and just scooped the mid-range so it's not as aggressive sounding, and just added some high end so it still has a nice sheen to it. Then the next thing I did was another EQ just to take out some low end around 200, 160, 180. And after that, a compressor just to give it a little bit of a smack to it. Okay, awesome. So after we had all that stuff done, I believe I added this compressor to the room. And let's just mute this kick here. So I added a compressor to the room, so without it, and then with it. And that just made the room sound a little bigger, and also gave it a little bit of movements. Alright. The next thing, I believe, was the snare. So I added the extra snare layer, the snare sample here, the X snare. Let's call that room, snare room. Or let's call it snare space. I added a snare sample within Superior Drummer itself. So how you do that is, if you don't know already, how you do that is you right click on your instrument, and then you do add to, and then center rimshot wherever you want to add to. I added it to the center, and the sample that I used was in the Superior Drummer preset sounds, and I used this mega snare sample. So let's just close that because I already have that here. I already have that loaded up here. And let's go to our snare sample. So once I loaded it up, it sounded like this. But I didn't want all that transient and all that attack from it, because I didn't want the snare sounding like a popcorn. So I took a transient designer and just took out all the attack from it. And this is what we had. And there was a little bit of a ring on it that I wanted to remove, like a metallic ring. So I used an EQ with a very narrow Q, and it took out a lot of around 500. So it goes from sounding like a construction zone to a much less ringy construction zone. Cool, so this snare was blended in with these other two snares, and just blended in lightly. And also I sent it to a bus, another bus, and put on a plate reverb onto that snare. Not too loud, but just there, just enough. Put the small plate just at its default settings. And at this point, we had something sounding like this. Or sorry, at that point, we had something sounding like this. Almost there, but the only thing I was missing was girth from the kick. And I don't remember exactly where I did this. I think I did the EQ on the output before, but we'll get to it in the end. Anyways, what I did was added 2 samples. And actually, while doing it, I was missing a little bit of girth, but while finding this kick, I ended up finding this kick as well, which had the perfect top end for it, so I decided to add this sneap kick in there as well. But what I was really looking for was just the meat kick. So here we have the kick here without any of the samples, and on the open stack I added, as I showed before, add 2, and then went to open, and all these sounds are a part of the Superior Drummer 3 basic package. So if you have that, you should have all these sounds. No extra packs were used. So if you go to Superior Drummer 3 preset sounds and just go to kick, there's the Andy Sneap kick that I used and the meat kick. So let's just close that because we have those loaded here already. And let's go back to our mixer. So once I loaded the meat kick, it sounded like this. And of course, I didn't want all that top end from the meat kick. What I mainly wanted from it was the bottom end. So I EQ'd all the top end out. So we have sort of a sub kick kind of thing. All right. And of course, that's routed through our kick bus. Then we have the sneap kick as well, which, as I mentioned, had just a really nice high-end bite to it. So I included that in there as well, and just put that out of phase because it was out of phase with the other 3 kicks that are already in there. Our meat kick and kick in and out. And yeah, the sneap kick is also sending through the kick 1, 2. And at this point, we had something like this. So when I referenced it with the track, there was a little bit too much low end on the kicks. So I took out the low end. That's why this was there. As I said before that we would get to it later. Well, took out some low end because the meat kick and the sneap kick combined with the original kicks that we had just a little bit too much low end. So I just took it out in our kick bus. So without the samples, so let's let's do this. Let me put this off first. And without the samples, this is how it sounded. And then with the samples, just a little bit too woofy on the low end. So with the EQ now. Excellent. So as I mentioned before, I did this not at the very end. I did this somewhere in the middle, but for our summary, I'm just going to mention it in the very end. I added an EQ to the master and just brought up all the oh no and just brought up all the high frequencies, just a gentle high shelf over here to give the whole kit a little bit of a sheen that the track had. And this is what we ended up with, and here's the actual track. Okay, now that I'm summarizing and listening to it again, I might just turn down the meat kick a bit, also the sneap kick, just turn those down a bit. And maybe just leave this EQ off. Cool, yeah, so that's essentially it. Yeah, I would leave this EQ off. And that's essentially it. That's what we have for recreating the Avenged Sevenfold Hail to the King drum sound in Superior Drummer 3. And actually, before we leave here, I forgot to mention one thing. For the kick, I did choose, I think the original kick that, the default kick that loads up is the Gresh round badge, but ended up choosing the Pearl Masterworks kick, 16x20 kick, because that sounded closest to what was here on the record. Yeah, that's essentially what we have for the Avenged Sevenfold drum sound in Superior Drummer 3. Awesome, so I'm gonna save this preset, and I'll make sure to leave a link of this down in the description below so you guys can download it. Alright guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.